Okay, this is a video on Venus and we are going deep. We are going deep into Venus. We are going to explore her and I want to take you into this journey. I want to drop you into this little rabbit hole where I'm hoping that you're not going to want to ever escape, because I'm hoping that after the end of this video you are going to really think more about Venus. You're going to want to explore her more and hopefully integrate her more into your life. So we're going to explore through the archetype of Venus, and I've titled this video The Bitter-Sweet Venus, because there is this bitter side of Venus, there is this darkness to Venus, and we're going to explore why. Because a lot of people don't really talk about Venus and her darker side or a bitter side, because she is so connected to the pleasures, the beauty, the sensual, and sometimes we disregard the darker side of Venus, but she does have that, and she is in everyone. She is integrated in everyone's life. If anyone says, and I've heard it said plenty of time, man and woman, saying that they don't have a lot of Venetian in them, they don't relate to the Venus, their Venus is very weak in their chart. Well, let me tell you that that is not true. Venus is really profoundly integrated in all our lives, and you will begin to understand that as we unfold Venus in this video. She is not as simple as people say she is. Again, I hear people saying that she's materialistic, she's shallow, she has this superficiality, and she is quite simple to work with and simple to understand. And yes, she is materialistic, she has that shallow side to her and that superficiality about her, but let me tell you that she is far from simple. She is complex. Venus has layers and layers and layers to her. She is so integrated into our life. She is woven intricately into the fabric of society, where she turns up in different facets of society. She is socio-economical, she is socio-political, she is socio-cultural, and you know, when we look at the common factors of Venus, her expressions, which is beauty and pleasure and sensuality and balance and harmony, we want to, in this video, try and understand where that all comes from. Where is it rooted from? Why is she connected to balance? Why is she connected to harmony? Why is she connected to beauty and adornment? She's also connected to wealth and property and land and the legalities and war even. She's connected to contracts and agreements and marriage, and of course this is where she can get very complex. So we want to dig in why she is connected to wealth, why is she connected to land and property and war. And I just want to put a kind of casual disclaimer out there, a little warning, because we're going to get deep into this video where some parts of it is not going to be very pleasant to listen to. Some of it can be quite uncomfortable to listen to, and also I want to say that what I bring to the table is not of my opinion. They are just what they are, so please don't shoot the messenger. So just a little disclaimer out there and a little warning. And I do want to say that we are going to go through certain issues that are quite delicate to listen to. So just bear that in mind as we go into the video. So let's have a look at some of these common traits that Venus has. She is, of course, the archetype of beauty. She represents the iconicness of beauty, and she's also connected to ornamentation, adornment, the aesthetics, and she also expresses pleasures and desires, and she is the archetype of harmony and of course relationships, as well as money and property, and like I said, the legalities and contracts and possessions and so on and so forth. And like I said, we're going to go deeply into why she is connected to all those things, because the more we understand Venus, the more that we are going to really understand ourselves. Now, we're going to look at the mythological side of Venus, but before we do that, I want to dive into some fun facts about Venus, some astronomical fun facts, because I really want to encourage people to, if you're into astrology, if you're into the planets, that you get some basic astronomy understandings about the planets, because it really helps you to understand how astrology just intuitionally kind of connects to that astronomical side of the planets. And I want to encourage people to look up the skies and get to know the constellations and also the wandering stars that, the planets that wander throughout the skies, so that you can just feel that deeper connection to the stars and the planets. And so Venus is the second planet from the Sun, and it is the closest planet to us. She is the brightest of all the planets, and indeed brightest of all. We like to call her the star, even though she isn't, because she does look like this bright star in the sky, and she is the the third brightest object in the sky. The first being the sun, of course, the second being the moon, and she is the third. And I have memories of when I was young, when we moved to a different part of North London, and I was 7, 8, 9, 10 at the time. And I remember sometimes opening the curtains early hours of the morning just before the sun rises, and I would catch this bright, beautiful, gorgeous star that would be just sitting in the sky on its own. Because the sun's just coming up, all the stars have disappeared, but because she's so bright, she still continues to shine in the sky. And sometimes I would see the moon or the crescent, and you'd have Venus hanging so beautifully like an ornament underneath the crescent. And I was just in wonder of her. And it wasn't till years and years later that I realized that it was Venus that I was looking at, and in such wonder of her beauty. And there you can understand how our ancestors connected her to beauty and jewelry and gems and perhaps even wealth, because you only have to look at her in the skies and she catches you. She catches your attention. And again, there's that attraction thing going on. So Venus is known as our twin planet because she has this relationship with us that's a bit like a mirror. And again, Venus, the symbol of Venus, even though it symbolizes the female, it is actually the symbol of the mirror, where the round part of the Venus symbol is the face of the mirror, the round mirror, and the cross is the handle. And that is probably partly connected to that in some ways that she does mirror us. And she is known as a twin sister because she is the closest to us. She's very similar in size. She's only a little bit smaller than us. And she has this terrestrial, rocky surface as much as we do, even though we also have a vast amount of water. But we also have rocky terrains. However, she has her rocky terrain is filled with volcanoes and lava. She is really, really hot in temperature. There is no way that we would be able to land there as human beings. She would sizzle us straight away. And she is also different in atmosphere. She has such a high pressured atmosphere that if we were to enter her atmosphere, she would crush us almost immediately, if not immediately. And that's quite apt in the way that we connect to Venus kind of lyrically, with our songs, like that Haka Haka Burning Love by Elvis Presley, where she has this burning temperature, and we connect our love with that burning love, our burning heart, our burning desire, our burning passion. And there's so many songs out there that relate to the quality of Venus as a planet. We've got that, what is that song? I'm your Venus, I'm your fire, your desire, Bananarama. And there's, we can relate to Venus when it comes to her heat and her burning. And also there is that, how we use the term crushing or crush, her crushing atmosphere, when we say, have you got a crush on him? Or, I've got such a crush on her, or I've got such a crush on him, or, my heart is crushed. And so it's really quite wonderful how our language is so intuitional in that way that we connect, our language intuitionally connects to the planet. And also, one of the other mirror effects of Venus is that she has this clockwise direction where she turns on her axis clockwise, whereas we turn, and as most of the planets turn anti-clockwise. And so the sun rises in the west and sets in the east on Venus. And for us, it rises in the east and sets in the west. So we can relate to this kind of mirror image of Venus and the Earth. She does have this orbital resonance with the Earth that we'll get into a bit later. So with Venus, she has this sidereal orbit, and that is the orbit around the sun. And she takes around about 250 Earth days to go around the sun. However, the unusual thing about Venus, just as much as it is unusual that she goes clockwise and the sun rises in the west, the other unusual thing about Venus is that her day is actually longer than her year. And that sounds really, really confusing, but the reason for that is that whereas we take nearly or just under 24 hours to rotate so that we see that sunrise and the sunset and sunrise within that 24 hours, Venus's rotation is so slow that it does take 243 days for her to do one rotation. So that's when the sun's coming up on Venus and then setting and then rising again. And that is longer than her year, the amount of the period that she takes to go around the sun in 250 days. And she does, of course, retrograde. She retrogrades for 40 days. And she gives us this morning star and the evening star, and that's to do with her retrogression. And our ancestors way back, used to get quite confused. They used to think that Venus was two stars, where they would see a morning star and they'll see an evening star at one point. And so they thought that she was two stars, but then eventually realized she was two of the same. And they tracked Venus, and they even made calendars, Venus calendars. The Mayans, the Native Americans would make Venetian calendars, and they had a real great understanding of Venus crossing through our skies. And there's such great history of Venus and how our ancestors were obsessed with Venus even so long ago. Now, as astrologically, if we look at Venus through the eyes of astrology, she is feminine in nature. She symbolizes the female body. And that doesn't mean to say that men cannot relate to Venus. We are all a mixture of the feminine and the male energy, the yin and the yang, the negative and the positive, whatever way that you want to put it. But we can't get away from the fact that Venus is feminine in energy, and she is the archetype of the female body. And Venus is the Roman goddess of beauty, fertility, love, and pleasures. And they later then adopted the Greek goddess of beauty, love, pleasure, etc., the goddess Aphrodite. And the story goes with Aphrodite is that she was born from the result of the castration of Uranus family jewels, where Cronus, as we know as Saturn, castrated his father, castrated his genitals, because of this forever intense copulation with his wife Gaia, who just could not take it anymore. And so Saturn, who was Cronus, Titan, who also gave, who is the father of the Olympians, Zeus being the youngest. Anyway, I'm digressing a bit here. But Saturn castrates his father, throws his genitals, throws his family jewels into the sea, and his genitals then turn into foam in the sea. And from that foam, Aphrodite is born. And I find that quite, I don't know what the word is, but it's kind of apt in a way, because we know now that the female chromosome to make a female is carried in the DNA or the chromosomes of the male sperm. So it is the male that has that female that then gives birth to the female. It's not the female that we have in our ovaries. We have the X chromosome, which is the male, but the male has the XY chromosome, the Y being the female. And all that time when Henry VIII was unforgiving to his wives because they gave birth to females, and all along it was his doing. So that's quite, there's some kind of reality to that, where Uranus, his family jewels get thrown into the sea, and that foam then turns into this most wonderfully beautiful female Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is that epitome of beauty. She is that symbolicness of Venus. And she is also, we see her astrologically, she is moist and warm in quality. She's that metal copper, which is conductive, and she is magnetic in nature, whereas we see the opposite Mars, that male energy, is electrical in nature. Mars is forceful. You can see electricity, you can feel electricity, whereas the magnetism is so much more subtle and it's invisible, yet it is so powerful. And that is the quality of the feminine energy. Feminine energy is magnetic in nature. And that conductiveness of copper as well, we can see how we can relate that to the attraction of Venus, the expression of Venus, where she attracts, where she brings others in. And I don't know whether you have memories, I do, where we're playing with the magnets in the science classes, and where the magnet, where if you put the two negatives together, they pull apart, but if you put the opposites, where you put the plus of the magnet and the negative of the magnet, they pull instantly together. And that is that conductivity and magneticness of Venus, where she attracts and brings together something or someone. Now, Venus is the ruler of Libra and also the ruler of Venus. In Eode astrology, before the outer planets were born, they, as in discovered, we had only 5 main planets, and they were designated to 2 signs. Venus being designated to Libra and Taurus. And as we've moved on, adding in the 3 outer planets, there are signs that got designated the outer planets. But 2 of the planets still hold 2 signs, and that is Mercury with Gemini and Virgo, and Venus with Libra and Taurus. And of course, Libra rules the 7th house of relationships, marriage, property, contracts and agreements, partnerships. And she rules the 2nd house, which is the house of Taurus, and the 7th house being the house of Libra. And the 2nd house is possessions and also wealth, but your own wealth, the individual wealth. And she is in the 2nd house about stability and security. She is detriment in Aries and Scorpio, and that because the ruling planet of those signs is Mars, and Mars being the opposition of Venus. And Mars is very much about the self and the ego, whereas Venus is all about stepping out of the self and stepping out of the ego, so to explore outside of herself. So that's why Venus is that opposite house of the 7th house, where the 1st house of Aries being about the self and the ego, and the 7th house is about outside of the ego, the relationships, the house of others. And she falls in Virgo, and probably why she falls in Virgo is because Virgo probably would make love into some kind of practical, like it would bring in practicality to love. So it would take the excitement out of love and the kind of chasing of pleasure and desire. And also Venus would have to be self-critical in Venus, and she doesn't very much like to do that because she doesn't have time to be self-critical. If she did, then there wouldn't be all this wonderful pleasure chasing and fulfilling her desires. And so, these are probably some of the reasons why she is detriment why she falls in Mars. And so she does rule the 7th and 2nd house, and she also is exalted in Pisces. And the reason for that is that Pisces is, when she's in Pisces, she exalts in Pisces because she's at home in Pisces. She becomes the higher frequency of herself, where passion becomes compassion, that pleasure love becomes unconditional love, that creativity of aesthetics and so on becomes more to do with the intuitional creativity, and the desire becomes more to something of a yearning rather than desire. And Neptune is the higher frequency of Venus because of all these reasons. And Venus does retrograde, and when she does, she retrogrades for 40 days. She has this cycle that we call the synodic cycle. And the synodic cycle is when we see the movement of Venus from Earth's point of view, from the point of view of how we see her in the skies. And the synodic cycle is where Venus has this wonderful resonance and dance between the sun and the earth. And this synodic cycle lasts for 584 days. And within that cycle, she retrogrades for 40. Now, as we said, with Venus, she orbits around the sun, and it takes around about 250 days. And Venus is never far from the sun. She never moves more than 47, 48 degrees away from the sun because she is closely positioned to the sun. And so with Venus, in our horoscope, we never get a square with the sun with Venus. Venus never squares with the sun. She never opposes the sun. She never trines with the sun. But she does at times sextiles with the sun. So she really does have this wonderful, harmonious, opportunistic kind of relationship with the sun. And she is visible in our skies for 263 days when she's the evening star, but also for just under 263 days when she's an evening star. And she has these kind of four main stages in the synodic cycle, where she has this 2 elongation periods in between when she has a conjunction with the sun. And the elongation at 47, 48 degrees is when she's the furthest away from the sun. And this is when she becomes the brightest because she doesn't have so much of that glare of the sun. And so this is when she is at the brightest in our sky. And in between that, she goes into conjunction where she becomes invisible to us, where she goes into this inferior conjunction with the sun. She becomes invisible, and she also at some point where she goes into that superior conjunction where she is invisible for about 50 days or so. And so she's under the beams of the sun. And this is when she has a period where she casimis with the sun. That is that she is in a complete conjunction with the sun. Now, it is within this synodic cycle and the sidereal cycle, these cycles which are so precise with Venus between the sun and the earth, really gives this kind of preciseness. And this is what gives Venus this beautiful, symmetrical pattern that occurs during the cycles as we see it from our point of view in the sky. So as she does her orbits around the sun, by the time she's done 13 orbits around the sun, she has then done, from our point of view, synodically, she completes 5 synodic cycles. So 13 orbits around the sun, the sidereal orbits, equals to 5 of our synodic cycles. And that takes a completeness of 8 years. So it takes 8 years to do the 13 orbits and the 5 synodic cycles. And in those 8 years, she she's unfolding. She is this unfolding flower. And then as the 8 years come to a head, and she's done the 13 orbits and the 5 synodic cycles, she produces this 5-petaled flower, or sometimes what we call the 5-pointed star, or sometimes we call it a pentagon, but more commonly it's known as the 5-pointed star or the 5-petal flower. And it is perfect. And here we can see again a reason why she is connected to beauty, symmetry, measurements, and why she is connected to harmony and adornment. Now, just to go back to the horoscope, Venus takes about 19 months to go through the entire horoscope, depending on when she's retrograding. And she goes through each sign it takes her about 18 to 45 days to go into and pass each sign. And that depends on if she's retrograding or not. And this 40 days number of Venus retrograding, this 40 days has a lot of implications, and it turns up a lot in human history. And we can relate it to the 40 number in many places in the Bible, where Jesus goes and disappears for 40 days, and he also fasts, and Moses disappears in a fasting mode for 40 days at Mount Sinai. And then we have the 40 days of the floods. And there's also where during Easter time there's 40 days of Lent, and it's commonly known as 40 days. It is actually 46 days, but when you take the Sundays away, the days of worship, they recognize it as a 40-day Lent, and that's connected to Jesus going off to the deserts, the desert. And there's also in Islam where when someone dies, you mourn for 40 days and 40 nights, and then after that there are prayers and also feeding the vulnerable and the poor. And things like even modern day, where there's a film that's called 40 Days and 40 Nights, where because of some kind of outbreak, some kind of disease, there is this quarantine for 40 days and 40 nights. And the word quarantine is actually an Italian word that relates to being enclosed for 40 days. That's the word quarantine. Very interesting. And so there is this kind of link to the 40 days and 40 days of Venus going into retrograde, where it seems to be connected to becoming introspect, withdrawing, fasting, purging, and then transforming. And there's this, like, the cleansing, the floods, starting all over again. And really, Venus, out of all the planets that retrograde, Venus is the most transformative of all. And it is her retrograding is very much connected to the story, the myth story of the goddess Inanna, sometimes also known as the goddess Ishtar, again the goddess of fertility and beauty and the feminine body. And in the story of Inanna, the goddess Inanna, she has a period where she goes underground, where she goes to visit her sister, who is the goddess of the underworld. And so she journeys to the underworld, and as she goes into the underworld, as she journeys to the underworld, she goes through 7 gates, and each gate that she passes, she takes off a garment or a adornment like a piece of jewelry, until she comes to the end of the last 7th gate, and then she enters into the center of the underworld, where she is completely naked. And there her sister kills her, and then her corpse is hung on a hook to basically rot. But then she has her missionary from Earth that begs for her to come back to life. And that is what happens. She's brought back to life, and then she journeys back onto the earthly plane, naked and as someone else. And so this is a really beautiful way to look at the retrograding of Venus, where we are always full of, this chasing of the pleasures and the desires and of wants. And we can get lost in that. We can become obsessional. And sometimes Venus can take us to some dark places where our pleasures and desires can make us feel insecure, where we can become obsessional, and where there is a kind of building of jealousy. And so we can see where Venus can take us on some dark journeys. And during the time of when she retrogrades, this is the time where we begin to release some of these obsessions and these ties that we have with our desires and our pleasures, very much kind of in relation to how some of these 40-day stories, are related to going inwards and cleansing through fasting, letting go the things that we really desire, like during Lent, where some of us might not fast, but we may give up that chocolate, where we may give up our favorite drink, give up alcohol for 40 days. And so we can see how Venus is really quite profound in the period of her retrograding, where this is really a time of transformation. So going back to Venus's cycle, this 8-year cycle, where she, with this dance that she does, she produces this 5-petal star, or the 5-petal flower, or the 5-pointed star. We can see, and hopefully I'll put a picture there, we can see that her retrograding has much to do with the formation of the star or the flower, where you can see there is an intersection between the petals and in between the triangles of the star, where she retrogrades and then turns forward. So she kind of turns into herself and then goes forward. And it is this intersection that helps to make this wonderful, beautiful, perfectly geometrical pattern. And if we have a look at these different cycles, where she has that 13-year orbit, that 5-year synodic cycle, and within that 8-year cycle, it has these number ratios of 13, 8 and 5, which is embedded into the golden ratio. And this is where we can really, really see how Venus is that archetype of harmony, and also the archetype of beauty, because it is the golden ratio that is connected to beauty. Now we see the golden ratio that occurs everywhere in nature, and how there is this kind of perfection to it. And it is this golden ratio that creates something that is so symmetrical and perfect that it is beauty in itself. And there are artists like Da Vinci and Michelangelo that use the Fibonacci sequence that's also embedded in this golden ratio, where they use the Fibonacci sequence in their paintings to create some form of perfection. So we can see how this golden ratio is really rooted into this expression of beauty and harmony. And so, even though it expresses beauty, we do know as human beings that we have our own idea of beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But generally speaking, and research has shown this, is that the most common idea of what we find beautiful is actually within this golden ratio. It's to do with symmetry. And, the idea of beauty, we can see this play out in all that we see as beautiful, and these idea of what is iconic in beauty. And indeed, in the past, we've had lots and lots of faces that are the iconicness of beauty. And it is because of this beautiful sacred flower and the golden ratio that she's connected to aesthetics. She's connected to the idea of beauty. Even today, Venus is part of this industry of beauty where what we use on our face and on our bodies we call cosmetics. And the word cosmetic comes from the word cosmos, which means the order or the harmony of the universe. It is the harmonious order of the universe. And, we see beauty play out in the media and in the world of cosmetics, the world of perfumery. But then that goes into that sensuality part of Venus that I'm going to go into in a minute. But with this idea of beauty, on this earthly plane, we can bring this kind of this shallowness to beauty. And as we know, we recognize that shallowness of Venus. There is this connection to fashion, connection to cosmetics, and she's very much a trendsetter. Venus is a real trendsetter. You can see her on the shallow side where she can set trends with fashion, with desires, with wantings. Kim Kardashian is a wonderful example where girls look at her and she just looks so extraordinarily beautiful. She is very strong. She has a very strong Venus in her chart, by the way. And she, the girls and the women just want to be like her. They want to wear what she's wearing. They want to look like her. And so there is that strong trend-setting influence that Venus has. And we can see it in fashion where people follow fashions and trends. In the UK, we have something called Keeping Up with the Joneses, where we have our neighbours and we're always trying to keep up with what they've got. And we're always trying to do one better where, you're looking over the garden or you're seeing Miss Jones come from, or Mrs. Jones come from shopping, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and they've bought, one of the latest mod cons or one of the most fashionable house item. And then you look back at your husband, you say, well, we need to go shopping, love. It's time to go and we need to get what she's got. Or better still, let's do one better. Let's get the next model up. This is what we call about keeping up with the Joneses. It's that trend setting. And, she has that expression of fashion, but we know that this is, yes, there is that shallow aspect of fashion, but fashion runs deep because it's not just about what we wear every day and what we follow and who we follow. It's to do with culture. It's to do with, there's uniform, there's traditional dresses that is connected to religion and different cultures and wearing a different kind of clothing to express a certain type of day or festivity. And these tell a story about what's behind these clothing. And also fashion, including music, because music has a lot to do with, well, it is Venus music. And also there is that trend setting with music where we go in and out of listening to certain musics. And then we have the trends of music throughout different periods. But we also know that when it comes to fashion, when it comes to music, it gets really into different layers of society where music can have this political stance to it. It can have these political expressions. It's not just about love and, attraction. It can go a lot deeper. And, music can cause a revolution. As much as fashion, sometimes fashion and music can move together. So we can see how Venus has that shallow part, but then she goes really, really deep with things that we think of shallow, like fashion, like music. But then, of course, this is how we go into the sensual part of Venus. And Venus, of course, is the archetype of sensuality. She is the expression of sensuality. She has this desire that needs to be fulfilled. And when I say she, I am talking about we. And we need these pleasures and desires to get through life, right? But then we can become obsessed with pleasure and desires. This, again, like I said, it can take us to these darker places where desires can become unhealthy. They can imbalance us, and they can bring up certain emotions that can be quite negative to our mind, our soul, and our spirit. And so with her sensuality, this is connected to the 5-star. This is connected to the 5 senses. And it is because of these 5 senses that we have the sensuality and desire. But of course, it just goes deeper than the 5 senses, because the 5 senses is what we use to explore the world, to pick up stimuli, and we use our 5 senses. And we can see in the 5-star where we see that these 5 stars symbolizes the 5 senses. We have the hands that feel through the world. We have the feet that feel through the world. We have our head that has the ears and the eyes and the nose, and the mouth that has the other 4 senses. And we use all these senses to feel through the world and to explore. And we have this stimuli that we pick up from our senses, but we also express through these senses. So Venus is all about impressing the senses and expressing the senses. So that is picking up the stimuli as well as where you're expressing the stimuli. And that stimuli is very connected to emotions. And this is why Venus is very, very much connected to the moon. It has a bond with the moon. Again, yet another feminine planet, another feminine energy. And there is this bond where Venus is that about the senses and the stimuli, and expressing and impressing the stimuli. And this is what then gets embedded into our memory, that then turns into emotions. So we have the senses, we have the stimuli, we have the feeling, and it could be the feeling of a different variation of feelings of anything that's between good and bad and pleasure and pain. And this gets embedded into, these feelings get embedded into our mind, into our memories, that then turns into our emotions, and these emotions are what turn us into very complex human beings. And it is these emotions that we walk through life through our emotions, and it is this continuous interwoven journey of the senses, the stimuli, the feelings, the memories and emotions that make us who we are. We are nothing but, apart from being spiritual and having a soul, a vessel that is a walking vessel of emotions. And so we see that deep rooted expression of Venus with her sensuality and her desire, because it is from this stimuli that we then grow this desire to have more of that stimulation, that's more of that stimuli, that more of that pleasure. And so this is deeply, deeply rooted into this 5-star and the 5 senses. And this really creates this kind of complex, really deeply profound, complex emotions that we have, because our pleasures and desires are connected to our emotions. They're not just shallow pleasure and desires. This is where Venus, we can kind of see that there is a facade about Venus where, oh, she's just about joy, pleasure and desire. But we can see now how the pleasure and desire is so deeply rooted into our memories, into our feelings, into our emotions. And it is so complex. It makes us who we are. So here we see where Venus really is interwoven, not into just our flesh, but right deep into our emotions and our soul. And we carry her with us every day. She is the daily, just like the moon is the daily. And we don't really say that about Venus. And I think this is a real important aspect about Venus, is that she is that every day, because we use our senses every day. We pick up the stimuli every day. And this makes this complex relationship with our emotions, and then of course our desires and pleasures, that's connected deeply into our emotions. It is so complex. This is the kind of reflection again about her complexity, about her complex dance that she does between the sun and the earth, where she does this, she dances this mathematical language, this sacred mathematical language that creates this sacred flower, this sacred star. And again, it is this stimuli, these senses, because Venus has to come out of herself to experience others, not just people, but the environment. And I don't want to put emotions and put it into this kind of simple category of it's just about stimuli and senses. Of course, our beliefs, our culture has a lot to do with how we shape our emotions. That has a lot to do with it, but it's mixed with that picking up the stimuli from our senses. But this is how we can also see where Venus is to do with relating from outside herself, depending on something outside to get some kind of feedback with her senses. So she has to experience something outside of herself. And this is how we can see this archetype, this expression of relationships. This is why Venus is such a social creature. She needs to be connected to the others, to allow the interaction to happen. And talking about collaboration and relationships, there is this book that I've got here, and it's written by Andrea Wolf, and it is called Chasing Venus. This is such an amazing story about, and it's factual, and it is a story about when there is this rare event of Venus crossing the face of the sun, and it just happens to be during the 7 Years' War in Europe. And there is this event, very rare event, that's taking place, that happened twice, 1761 and I think it was 1769. And the story really is about how so many scientists had to get together to chase Venus during this rare event, so to measure the universe. And here we have this language coming in, this intuitional language, where chasing Venus, that chasing that we do, that's so Venusian. Measurement of the universe, that's Venetian again, that measurement, that scaling, and how men get together, humans get together, and that's that relationship where they had to somehow get together during this perilous time of when it was so dangerous to go on journeys and to get together when everyone is having these different political disagreements. And this is where in the story Andrea Wolf shows that these men metaphorically kind of put their swords down for 2 days and pick up their telescopes, and somehow they get together during this time of bloodshed and disagreements, war, and just so that they can witness together this event, so they can collaborate what they have seen, what they have measured, so to measure the universe. This was the first ever international scientific collaboration in history. Isn't that so Venus? Isn't that so Venus about harmony and friendship and relationships and democracy and being together and depending on each other? These men depended on each other just for 2 days, and then after 2 days, everything went back to disagreement and war. That is the magic of Venus, and how magical that was, because it was such that rare event where she showed herself in front of the sun. Such a rare event that she says, if we come together, if you just put the swords down, if you collaborate, then I will give you this gift. I will give you some answers to the universe. How wonderful is that? Again, Chasing Venus, really wonderful. I still haven't finished it, but it is so enticing. It's full of adventure and excitement. Wonderful book by Andrea Wolf. And just before I forget, I just want to mention there is a website called sophiavenus.com. And this astrologer who wrote a book called The Venus Star Point, she is probably the astrologer that knows most about Venus. She has done so much work on Venus. She's done over 40 years of research on Venus. And she has this wonderful website where she talks about how there is this Venus chart, this star chart, this Venus star chart that one can draw up, and that's separate from the natal chart. That gives a description of how Venus runs through you and how she has such an influence over your life, and you know how you kind of move through this world. So have a look at this website. It's called sophiavenus.com, a really beautiful website as it goes. So bit by bit we are seeing how Venus, you know, we're starting to understand a bit more about Venus, like why is she connected to beauty, why is she connected to symmetry and harmony and indeed sensuality. And but we also know that Venus has this connection to wealth and the legal system, and also property and contracts, and also war. She's connected to war. You know, the reason why she's probably connected to war, we can go as early as the mythical story of Helen of Troy. And again, another iconic beauty character. And this is a story where Aphrodite wants to settle some affairs with the king of Sparta, and she does so by offering the king the most beautiful mortal woman alive, which is, of course, Helen. And they get married, and then Helen does a number on her husband, and she goes off and elopes with Paris of Troy. And sometimes there's different versions of this. Another version is that she was abducted by Paris of Troy. So this obviously angers the king of Sparta, and this entices the war, the Trojan War. But we can actually correlate war to Venus, because if we look at what most wars, if not all wars, are about, is that it is about taking possession or ownership of something, probably land. And again, Venus is connected to land and property. And war is almost, if not all the time, connected to gaining a piece of land, or controlling a piece of land, or taking possession of land, or a part of the world where there is something that can bring wealth, like oil or diamonds, etc. And again, here we see that wealth coming in, of where there is value put onto something that is material, but it is of such importance that it can produce a possessiveness either collectively or individually, an obsessiveness, a need to take something and keep it as yourself for your own. And so here we can see that rootedness to war, where it is connected to possessing something of wealth, or possessing something to control something, to have a piece of land. I actually cannot think of a war unless you're maybe talking about certain religious wars, but then if you look deeper into religious wars, there's usually wealth involved in there somewhere, but let's not get into that. That's another story, another time. Anyway, so here we see that link to war. Now, Venus connected to wealth. This is where we can look back into history, where Venus is connected to the legal system. And again, we're looking at property and land and possession. If you look at where Venus, when astrology was practiced way back in the day, the astrologers were always men. And although we can argue that maybe we're still living in under a patriarch system, again, that's not my argument, we can definitely say that most societies were under patriarchal rule. And so the laws were very much patriarchal in nature. And we can then look back and see how male astrologers, seeing and knowing that of course Venus is feminine in energy, and she symbolizes the she symbolizes the female body. Well, from a male perspective, how the people used to think way back in the days of ye olde, where, and actually even not so far from where we are now, where the female body was something to not just explore, not just to have pleasure, but to own and to exploit. We see that there has been tribes that have, where the father bestows his daughter to a man for the price of something that has value. He will bestow his daughter and enter her into a marriage in the agreement that if I give my daughter to you, you give me some cattle, or you give me a cow, or you give me some crops, or you give me a little hut, or you give me a small piece of land. And so here we see where the female energy, that feminine symbol of Venus and the feminine body, is seen as having value, as seen as having a proportion of wealth. And even in the Western world, we see right up to, I know in the UK, right up to the 19th century, where if a woman was to get married and become a wife, she would have to relinquish all that she owns. She would have to relinquish everything she owns to her husband. She would have to relinquish her property, her finances, anything that she possesses, any property, anything of value, including her body. The husband would have complete control of all her assets, including her body. And we know that in history it has been shown, and it was common practice, where if a woman was shown to be depressed or unsure about things, or she had bad menstrual pains, and maybe she became emotional or introvert or whatever that she's gone through, that from her husband's eye wasn't agreeable to him, where he would see maybe sometimes her talking about her emotions would be a form of hysteria, where the husband had a right to sign the wife into an asylum. And there she would stay until the husband will agree to release her from the asylum. And it's quite distressing to think that these things happened. And this was only, I think, I might be wrong, but I think this ended, it might have ended in the 1940s or 50s, but I might be wrong. But I do know that right up to the 19th century, you had full control and property over your wife and all her assets and her body. And also there was this practice that, wasn't all that rare, where you could sell your wife in a market. And, the husband would come in to the market with her wife like she was a piece of cattle, like she was a piece of meat, where she was treated as cattle, where sometimes there would be a rope around her, or she'd be bound by the wrist with rope. And she would be put to auction and sold up to a certain amount of money. And for whatever reason, whether the husband got fed up of the wife, he wanted to get rid of a wife, he wanted to marry another wife, or for some reason he needed some kind of financial gain for whatever reason. But this was a practice that ended right up to the end of the 19th century. And then, of course, if we're talking about marriage, we can include in the Indian practice of the dowry, where, again, this is illegal in India, but we know that this still takes place, illegal or not, it still takes place behind closed doors. And so we see here where the wife, where the female body, and what comes with the female body, which is fertility, children, and some kind of service, where there is a value put to it. And we even see it here in the modern day. Here, I know in England, if you are married, you can pay less taxes. So then your own value, your own finances are perked up a bit, because if you're married, you pay less taxes. So here we can see how the expression of Venus here with wealth and property, land and contracts and agreements and the legal system is rooted here in Venus, if we look back in history. And indeed, even now, if we talk about prostitution, where prostitution, as old as time, as we say sometimes the oldest profession in the world, again, here we see where prostitution has a value, be it not much value for the woman, but certainly has value to the recipient, and has this kind of measurement of wealth. And although, again, prostitution, yes, we can talk about it back in the day, but we know that this is still something that is happening today with backstreet prostitution, where there is sex trafficking, which is one of the biggest, if you want to call it an industry, I don't even want to call it industry, I don't know what to call it, that accumulates one of the most wealth. And also, a lot of people don't know that Venus and Aphrodite was also not just about the feminine and the beauty, she was also about promiscuity and also about prostitution. Aphrodite was the patron of prostitution, and so she was revered by prostitutes. And we can also look at the word sexually transmitted disease, venereal disease. The word venereal is the Latin word for Venus. So we're talking about Venus disease, which is thought to and believed even to this day that it is connected to promiscuity. Now, does that mean that promiscuity is wrong? Does that mean that we can't be liberal in our sexual desires and so on? I don't think that's what this is all about. What it is about is that it is about the exploitation of the female body. It is about the exploitation of the female energy. Why is it that Venus and the female body and the female energy is open to exploitation, where there is this kind of possessiveness over the human body, where there is this wanting to take over, to exploit, to the point that it creates oppression and suppression and pain and struggles? This is because the female energy, one of the biggest expression of Venus is receptiveness. And Venus is receptive because of needing to step out of the other, needing to relate to the other or outside of itself, and to interact and to bring in. And Venus cannot do that without being receptive. You have to look really deep into this receptivity of the feminine energy, which also the moon has. But because Venus has been linked to the female body and the sensuality of the female body, this receptiveness is open to vulnerability. And it is because of this open vulnerability that brings in this kind of interaction of exploitation. And Venus needs that receptiveness, because without this receptiveness, we cannot have relationships, or at least we cannot have a balanced relationship. We cannot have harmony in a relationship without receptiveness. And to have a good relationship, we need to be vulnerable. To be in love, we need to be vulnerable. But with that, hand in hand, comes that exploitiveness, comes that taking for granted. We often say that sometimes, oh, I've been vulnerable, I've loved, but I've been taken granted of. I've been I've been taken advantage of. And that's the unfortunate thing of this receptive vulnerability, is that it brings in this disadvantage, this using, this taking, and this exploitation. And this can be really difficult to hear when we think about the history of the exploitation of the feminine energy and the feminine body. It is really, really difficult to look at. And we know that although laws have been changed and views have been changed somewhat, that there is still this exploitation going on. We see it in media, where the female body, the female beauty is exploited to sell products in the world of advertisement. And we know that prostitution has always continued, even though women have this independent choice to become sex workers, but we still know that there is that underground prostitution taken on. We know that dowry still in India, the dowry still continues behind closed doors. We know that there are still certain societies that allows that a wife has to relinquish certain things about her or whatever she owns. So there is still so much to try and bring Venus into a place where her vulnerability is not taken granted of and is not exploited. But how do we do that? How do we ensure that the Venus in us, the vulnerability, the receptiveness and the vulnerability of the human energy, of that feminine energy and the feminine body, how do we ensure that we end this exploitation and the taking of granted in a collective way as well as in an individual way? How do we then look at wealth when we look at how do we measure Venus in our charts? When we want to look at wealth, when we want to look at, how she kind of moves through us in that kind of materialistic ways when it comes to possessions and wealth. And I think the answer here is that we look up to the skies again, and we are aware of her sacred dance. We are aware of her sacredness, her sacred geometry, her sacred feminineness, her sacred divineness, and that we are aware of this and that we appreciate the sacred feminine energy. Can you imagine that if the patriarch system in the past and even now, and even the male astrologers, if they were aware, truly aware of that feminine sacredness and that feminine energy and the appreciation of it, how things might have been different? I like to think that it would have been different. I like to think that it can be different. And I think it is that constant reminder of that holy dance that she does. And to, remember that we kind of cradle that vulnerability, that receptivity, but without overprotection. And we cradle it with a sense of liberation, and we cradle this vulnerability with integrity. And I think that's a very powerful word to use for Venus, is that as we go through the pleasures in life, as we experience Venus, is that we do Venus with integrity. And I think the key word with Venus, I think the real epitome of Venus, the real main expression of Venus is that sacred flower, which has this loud expression of balance, symmetry, balance. I say it against balance. Balance is the key word for Venus. It is where Venus, and we can see this with her retrograding, where she has to, in this earthly plane, because Venus is so earthbound in us. And I think we forget that, because we can see this language that she is constantly communicating to us. She's constantly saying, look at this beauty, feel the pleasure, chase the desires, but do it with balance, do it with integrity. Do it where she understands duality so well. This is what the scales are about. She understands that duality of good and bad, of night and day, of pleasure and pain, of the need and the want. She totally understands the nature of duality, and she understands that us being earthbound, a life is nothing without pleasure and joy. And she offers us that, but she offers us a way to do it with integrity and balance. This is what her symmetry, her her sacred mathematical language is all about, is about balance, is about going not completely that way, not completely this way, having a little bit of that, experiencing a little bit of this, and somewhere meeting in the middle, somewhere coming in between that duality, that Goldilocks point, that just right point, which is so difficult to do. It's not easy. Venus is not giving us something easy, and this is why Venus is not simple to work with. She is that profoundness. She is where we battle between that deep desire and that want to something that is what we need to live, to secure ourselves and to have that integrity. And she is wanting to pull us somewhere in the middle where it's just right, and it is difficult. It is where she symbolizes the scales in Libra, where have you ever tried to balance the scales? Have you ever tried in these old-fashioned scales where you have the two cups? They're empty. And what is life if it's empty? No, we have to add things into our life to make our life, to do more than just exist. And so we put something on one cup and you can see how it weighs us down, where it becomes heavy and the empty cup is just lifted. And so we try and balance it with something. But if you try and balance these cups, you can see how so difficult it is to get just right. And she has that symbol where we see it in justice, where she holds that symbol of the scales and she's blindfolded. And this is her telling us where we are moving materialistically through this world, where we're feeling our pleasures and our indulgence, and where sometimes we can make bad judgment. But to make good judgment is for us to close our senses, to be blind and to go inwards and use our heart, use our intuition to make good judgment, to balance the scales. And the true worth in Venus is the value and the worth of the sacred feminine. The sacred feminine, the sacred feminine body, the sacred feminine energy. This is her true value. This is her true worth. So we have gone really deep into Venus. We have gone onto this deep journey, and I hope now you're into this rabbit hole of Venus where you are going to explore more and see how you can integrate her into your life more, because she's present in us every day. And there's just so much to talk about Venus, and if I had you in the room, we would be talking about Venus for about 6-7 hours. And I just hope that I've fitted enough in for you to grow more of an interest in Venus, to make you more curious about Venus, and give you something to digest. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and we have come to the end, and hopefully I will see you next time. I am going to put the Venus through the houses and Venus through the signs and Libra through the houses down at the description box below. Until then, do take care of yourselves. Bye bye.